Hello, and welcome to another discussion here regarding social media and digital marketing analytics. Today, this is going to be broken into two videos. And so, to start with, we're going to actually talk about the social media marketing chapter on social media metrics and analytics. And this is not going to be a super intense, lengthy video that goes into detail about every single number that is necessary, but rather we're going to start big picture and go down, move more specific from there. Really, to start, I am going to share some slides today. I don't always do that, but for today, I will. I did have some. There are some elements to this textbook chapter that I wanted to share. And it really begins with the idea of social media's role in a larger organization, both both in terms of budget, but then also the impact on the bottom line. That's really kind of where this whole conversation begins. In that we don't want to think about social media metrics and analytics just from a vanity standpoint, or even the having a just a general campaign ROI, but we want to think more holistically, more big picture on how the business is operating in general and how social media can actually make an impact on the growth of the business. For me, that's really been a big selling point throughout my career, and hopefully for all of you. I mean, you're all MBA students. You'll be able to utilize some of these best practices as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation here. And I will turn off my video for this piece. So a couple of slides to call attention to. First off, I'm going to run through these couple to begin. First off, if you download the slides right out of the book, or because you can do that, or if you look at that first section, there may be some mention of older metrics from about 2017, 2018, 2019. However, the pandemic has really changed the way that we look at social media, both from a spending perspective and then also the importance of social media on a business in general. Back in the day, we used to say that only about 10% of marketing executives believed that social media was an above average contribution. However, that has since changed. So I actually pulled out this data from Statista, and what you have here is the annual social media spend as a percentage of larger marketing budget. And this table that was here before in the older version and is in the textbook cuts off in 2019. So you'll see here, we actually look at data that goes all the way through February of this year. And I don't have anything more recent than that, but you'll see there's a nice uptick there in June of 2020, thanks to the pandemic and the massive shift that happened when we went online entirely. Now that percentage, there was a kind of a retraction there in 2021, but then 2022 is back up to 17.8%. So not bad. I personally think that we're going to be hovering between 18 and 20% moving forward, at least until there's another inflection point or something else occurs where we are looking at more necessary spending with social media. But if you go look backwards, 2019, 2018, all the way back to 2015, and I didn't have space to fill up anymore, but we were pretty steady between 8 and 10%, 11%. I personally thought we were going to be on a slowly upward trajectory, because you do see there is a slight increase year over year, 9.9, 10.6, up to 12, and up to 13, but it was going to be really drawn out. I do think the pandemic jump-started that, because it jump-started a lot of things in terms of the way that we use technology, and especially on social media. You saw over the first 12 months of that pandemic, between April 2020 all the way through, heck, up till about August or September of this past year, Most social networks, we're seeing massive gains in revenue, user bases, more audiences, more diverse audiences. I mean, Pinterest has seen a 50% increase in men over the last 18 months. Like, who would have seen that coming? I do think those are going to come back down to more normalized numbers, as we've seen, stock prices were skyrocketing in that same time period, and now they're coming back down to earth. I think they all are, but it really showed that, or the pandemic really showed that our usage of social media is something that is maybe not a necessity, but it's something that I think people realize that they can utilize more things for. A lot more delivery, online ordering, a greater sense of community, just a lot going on. But the one thing I could not find for this class was an updated version of this survey. The big takeaway here on this slide is that executives do not believe that social media is actually contributing to the bottom line, but now I believe that they are starting to slowly come around. Again, this data only goes through August of 2019, so this is not apples to apples with what you see back here. But it's still worth bringing up, and it is a good point, because this is kind of the Kickstarter for a larger discussion on metrics. Why don't executives see social media as being a driver of the bottom line? So the question that the textbook asks is, why are investments in social media marketing seemingly not paying off? Well, I don't think we're actually asking the right questions. First off, there is the idea that social media is a fairly recent marketing phenomenon, which means that we don't necessarily know how to quantify job performance, campaign performance, or even the idea of social media's performance in general on a company's bottom line, much less in the marketing department's bottom line alone. And the idea here is that we often have lived, over the last 10 to 15 years, we've lived in a society where all online activities are being considered as something that leads to immediate sales, micro buyers, impulse buys, all of these elements where we think, okay, we're going to spend money on, say, Google ads, we should be expecting an immediate return and eventually some profit once we get that cost per click down to a certain amount. Now, social media in general, there is an element of social media, paid social media, which we'll come back to later in the semester. That part is certainly one that people would like to associate with sales, or as we look at in the AIDA funnel, the action stage. We believe that social media advertising can jumpstart the AIDA funnel, move people from awareness down to action in the matter of a couple of clicks. That doesn't change the fact that it still takes 5 to 7 interactions with a brand before you can actually generally get somebody to become a customer. Now, this slide is important because it talks about the shift in the funnel. And that is, organic social media really needs to be thought of as a higher funnel element. I do not have the AIDA funnel in these slides here today, but if you want to think back to last week, week 1, we really want to think about social media as being part of the awareness stage and the interest stage, maybe the desire stage, but certainly not the action stage. That is, social media is usually people's first or second interaction with a brand. Sometimes it is the very first organically. You see something shared, or even with when you just see it come across, maybe a people you may know, pages you may know, pages that friends follow. But when we think about where social media's true value is in the AIDA funnel, to me, I look at it more as being in the interest stage, and that you've already heard of the company once, you see the content that they're promoting on social media, you see that there's some value to be derived from it, and you go ahead and give them a follow. That leads to the interest stage. Now, there are numbers here that we start getting into what are the analytics that go into this. Well, I guess to take a step back, the number one thing I think about when it comes to showing social media's performance, expectations need to be managed with higher ups in that. If your CMO or your CFO or whoever is going to allocate a certain budget to a social media campaign, you need to tell them up front, what those KPIs need to be. If it's going to be an awareness campaign, they should not be looking for sales. If it's going to be something where you're looking to drive new leads to business, think about realistically what that could look like. Do you have all the mechanisms in place, which we'll talk about it later? But then also, what are the numbers that you're actually looking for? Impressions are largely vanity metrics, but to a certain extent, you do need those because you need engagement numbers. And you want to be able to think about the idea that people just can't come to your landing page and be expected to fill out a lead form the first time. No, this is something where you need some frequency. So you really want to think about metrics that can be proxies for consumer awareness specifically. Now, if my slides didn't do that, we'd be able to think about where social media can affect these different elements. Now, in this textbook, they don't use the AIDA funnel. They look at social media specific forms of interaction, specifically awareness, engagement, attitude or sentiment, and advocacy, which is like brand advocacy or loyalty. And that's that mysterious fifth step in the AIDA funnel, if you will, where people go from being just buyers to being brand advocates. So what are those metrics? You can generate awareness, you can increase engagement, you can improve some positive attitudes, some advocacy. You could align these with steps in the AIDA funnel. I would say, obviously, that first one is awareness, engagement, consumer awareness. Number two is probably the interest, maybe even the desire stage. Positive attitudes are generally desire. Sometimes I would just say desire. Advocacy, I would not say action. I would use advocacy as being more loyalty. Now, when you think about awareness, you want to look at metrics that will tell what are the size and the growth rate of a social media audience. When you think of awareness and social media, you think of audience first. This is one area where I do believe impressions are important, especially when it comes to small businesses. And the reason behind this is, sure, engagement rates are important. Yes, revenue is important. All of those really, really deep and money-driven numbers that actually lead to revenue, those are all very important. But you don't get any of those if you don't have impressions. If you're working with a small business that has 200 followers on each social network, it doesn't matter how many engagements they get because nothing's going to be enough considering how many impressions they're not getting. So there does need to be an element of stress being placed on the idea of impressions if you don't have that critical mass of followers. In addition, you want to think about the mentions that you get because that can help spread awareness and vis-a-vis more followers. You want to think about brand related content, specifically on videos, and then the number of followers, of course, to begin with. As anybody who works in social media will tell you, just because you have an X number of followers doesn't mean that's how many people are going to see your content. On the contrary, we're looking at anywhere from 2 to 10% of followers typically seeing organic posts. On Facebook, I've seen that number as low as 1%, especially with B2B. Now with something like a local organization or restaurants, I mean, you can see 30 to 50% because it just as the way the algorithm goes and the type of content that's being shared, being more shareable, more engaged with, sure. But then if I look on LinkedIn, I typically get no more than, I get it between 10 and 20% on my all the company pages that I monitor right now. Not bad, but at the same time, it's not great. When I see that I have 5,000 followers and then I'm only seeing 1,000 people are seeing it, it's not that impressive. And then if you go and you think about engagement rates, okay, so even if you say, okay, I have 5,000 followers, I have 1,000 people that saw my post. If your engagement rate is 2%, you're now looking at what, 20 people? No. Yeah. 20 of 1,000, that's a 20% that's a 2% engagement rate. Maybe you have a click-through rate of 1%, so that's 10. That's pretty small. And I do think 5,000 or I do think when you look at impressions, after you cross that 1,000 threshold, you can think about engagements and more in terms of rates and percentages than just sheer numbers. But if you're dealing with double-digit numbers, single-digit numbers, you really, your engagements are going to be minuscule, and you want to think really big picture. You do want to focus on improving the impressions and the awareness here, like on the slide. Now, when I talk about engagement, though, what does that mean? For those of you who do not work in social media, this slide is for you. Engagement rate engagement is anything that happens with a social media post or a page that shows somebody in the audience is interacting. That can be a like, that can be another reaction, which I know on Facebook there's a dozen of them now. It's a comment, and it's a share, anything with a post. Leaving a review, a click through to the website, it's anything that can happen with a post. There has been some renewed discussion recently about if a click, it counts as an engagement because you're not actually engaging with the post, you're taking an action off the site. That's not for discussion in this class. My personal opinion is that yes, a click is an engagement, and that it's one of the more important engagements, because without clicks, what are you trying to do? A lot of times, most of the clients that I have worked with in my time as a consultant, the idea behind social media, because they're mostly B2B, B2C. The idea is generally that you want the audience to find your content valuable, give you a like, and if there is a link to an external third-party content, it's not self-serving. It's like a third-party article or a blog post or a video or something else. But then that one time does come when you want people to click through to your website, make a purchase, drive some sales, use social media to actually build a business. That's where clicks are important. That's where clicks are the only engagement that matters. And a high click-through rate helps. For all intents and purposes, it's going to help the algorithm deliver your post to more people, because it shows that people are finding it valuable. Now, social networks also generally are of the mind that if you leave their site, you leave their platform, then they don't want you. They don't want your content. That's certainly true to an extent. That doesn't mean that you should never post links, because then that really kind of kills a lot of the content that you would otherwise post. Rather, you should be spending time on making sure that it's valuable links that you're putting out there. But again, we have all semester to dig more into that. Positive attitudes. I mean, this is sentiment. This is positive or negative sentiment. Metrics that reflect this are really just, again, the types of engagements, the specific engagements that we have, but then also the share of positive engagements versus negative engagements. There are lots of tools out there that will look at all the comments on posts and measure them as either positive or negative or neutral based on the word choice. So if you see words like bad or profanity or a lot of different things, these machines can tell if this is a positive or a negative post. There's tons of exceptions, of course, and these machines have become very adept at being able to tell when somebody is using a negative word for a positive reason, like, oh, that product's bad, like saying that in a good way. There's certainly an element of learning that goes on. That's machine learning 101, I guess. But being able to measure sentiment and attitudes towards a brand are really important. It's a good piece for social media, and a lot of companies use that. You do want to make sure that your company is not super tiny. I like to use sentiment more in situations where there's a major announcement and a lot of responses, where just saying, oh, we got 100 responses doesn't really tell you much. Like, of course, it's great. If you had told me it was 300 responses, I'd have the same reaction. But were those good responses? That's really where you can start measuring brand equity and trying to determine, okay, is this helping people see our brand in a more positive light? Finally, we have customers and customers help in gaining more customers as referrals, word of mouth, testimonials, rating products well, your net promoter score, things like that. I would say this is probably the most difficult one and the one that you're going to see the most, or see the least, sorry. When I am measuring social media metrics, the ability to, the positive testimonials, the referrals, the word of mouth, I mean, those are going to be not only the least common, but they're also very much, they can be hard to find if they don't tag you, for example. If they don't tag a customer, that could be a challenge. Sometimes they're posted in private groups. One of the, I would argue that one of the most important areas for companies to keep an eye out are private Facebook groups, or the Nextdoor app, or Yelp. Places where people aren't just leaving reviews, but they are actively writing an original post proactively about a company, good or bad. The final thing to talk about in this chapter, though, is making sure that you find what's relevant and not just everything that's available. This is really important for the final exam, that concept. Because if you look at all of these metrics, I mean, this is an old graphic. But the number one thing I want you to look at is just the fact that these numbers are all high, right? The lowest thing you see is actually increase in average order size at 24%, which is actually a pretty important one. But after that, all but 3 of these are measured by at least 50% of the 55% of the businesses, when in reality, you need to pick 3 to 5 KPIs and really focus on those, because you want to measure what is relevant and not just everything that's available. If you measured everything that's available, you'll be doing a Facebook page report for hours and hours and hours. What is going to make the most sense for a brand, given what they're working on, what the certain campaign is, what the larger marketing strategy is, and then also even going bigger, what is the point, what is the role of social media for this business as an organization? Again, it's not always going to be revenue. It actually, I would argue, most organic social media is not about revenue generating, at least not directly. It is about brand awareness, generating loyal customers, loyal repeat customers, building brand equity, generating positive attitudes, and really being able to make a brand more visible to the wider community and the larger target audience. And that's going to be all that I go into today on this chapter. This will not be the standard for all of the chapter videos that I go through. I just wanted to go through this one specifically because analytics is a key part of the course. It's not going to be every week, but if there's one week where analytics are really at the forefront, it's this week, and then also one of the last weeks. So that concludes today's video. I hope some of this makes sense. And if you have questions, as always, please feel free to reach out with any questions via email or Canvas or anything else. Thanks.